All right, angle of any magnitude. Now, if you look at this particular problem we have right in front of us, we have the question written as determine all of the angles between 0 degree and 360 degree, whose sine is what we have here and what we have here. Now, there is an emphasis I need you to not forget. Two emphases actually. Number one is all, and number two is 360 degree. You see, when you're told to find all of the angles, that's obvious that you cannot just do the normal sine theta equals to 0.7962, theta equals to arc sine of 0.7962, and that's all. Because obviously this will give you just one answer. So you can see that when you see the word all, that's implying that you're going to have more than one particular answer. So let me walk you through on how to solve this particular problem. Stay focused, and you will see a very simple technique, very simple process for answering questions like this without missing it. So the very first thing to note is what trigonometry function are we dealing with? We are told to determine the angles between this and this. Whose sine is this? So we're dealing with the sine. All right. Now, the first thing you have to write is what I've written here. Sine theta equals to this. So it's very important you always know how to interpret that very first statement, because they said determine all of the angles whose sine, that means the sine of an angle, was equals to what you have here. So if you're going to write this second one, you're going to write sine theta, because they said all of the angles whose sine, that means the sine of an angle, was equals to minus 0.2594. So you want to find what those angles are, in which their sine is going to give you this particular value. So that's the very first interpretation you must first bring out. So in answering question number A, the first thing I'm going to write is what I've written before. Sine theta equals to 0.7962. Now, this is the very first thing to do. The next thing to do is to go back to your understanding of the quadrant. So I'm sure you don't forget the quadrant. The quadrant that itemizes the trig functions and what their signs will be. We have A here, we have C here, we have S here, and we have T here. I told you already, all students take calculus or add sugar to coffee. So obviously you can see from here that this is the first quadrant, this is the second quadrant. We are moving anti-clockwise. This is the third, and this is the fourth. So from here you can see that if you look carefully, you would see that for this particular question, the sign here is positive. You can see, even though we don't have any sign there, but once you don't have a sign, you know that you are going to be having a positive sign there. In this other case, the sign was negative. So here we have a positive sign. So what you'll be asking yourself first of all is, on which quadrant are we going to have sign being positive? So, and if you don't forget, all these itemizes where you have positive values for each of the trigonometry ratios. So for here we have all, that means sine, cos, and tan is all positive here. Sine is positive, tan is positive, and cos is positive. So obviously you see that we have both the first quadrant and the second quadrant as the quadrant in which we're going to be having a positive sign for the sine trigonometry function. So that means we are dealing with both quadrant 1 and quadrant 2. Those are the two quadrants we are dealing with in this particular question. That's the very first thing you have to note. What quadrant are you dealing with, since you are having a positive sign? Now, knowing that you're dealing with the first and second quadrant, of course, I told you in a previous video that there are different systems that works in this quadrant. For this particular second quadrant, we have 180 minus theta as what happens there, and then for this third quadrant we have theta plus 180, and for the fourth one we have 360 minus theta. So obviously they are all, the very first one is just between 0 to 90 degree. We don't have a particular system working there. It's just whatever your value is, as long as it's less than 90 degrees, you will just replace that as the first quadrant. So in this case now, the next thing to do is what I often tell students is that whatever sign was here, either positive or negative, you would act like you cannot see any sign here. You will just ignore the sign, either positive or negative, and go on to do what you normally do, and that's theta equals to arc sine 0.7962. So this is you just trying to solve the normal way, but don't forget that's not going to be your final answer, because here we're dealing with angles between 0 and 360. So you go on to have arc sine. In this particular place, you will be needing your calculator, and I would advise you should make sure your calculator is on degree so that you don't get a wrong answer. If it's on radian, you may be getting a different answer. So if you press this on your calculator, you'll be having theta as 52.777. So we can write that as 52.8 if we want, or depending, let's fix it as 52.8. So we have theta as 52.8. Now this is our very initial step, but mind you, I said already, in some cases, this will not be one part of your answer. In some other cases, this will be part of your answer. Now let me tell you when you're going to know if these first workings will be part of your answer or not. Well, if your answer for what signs is your, well, in short, depending on what quadrant you found out when you were finding out the quadrant, if quadrant 1 was included, that means if you have quadrant 1 featured in the quadrant you were interested in, then this will automatically be part of the answer. Let me repeat that. So if one of the quadrant you brought out was quadrant 1, then whatever you did here, you will just replace it there. But if you don't have quadrant 1 as part of the quadrant you are interested in, then this will not be part of your answer. That's very key for you to understand that. So let's look at it right here. For the fact that we have quadrant 1, don't forget we're dealing with quadrant 1 and quadrant 2. So our quadrant 1 already, since it's featured there, we already know automatically that we'll be having this as our answer. So for the answer in quadrant 1, I will just fix in there that theta is equals to 52.8. Now let me say this. Whatever answer you fix in for your quadrant are your final answer. So your quadrants are what will determine what the final answer to this question will be. So for quadrant 1, I told you just replace whatever you have done here initially, replace it with quadrant 1. And for quadrant 2, you go on to check what was the rule that operates in quadrant 2. You can see that 180 minus theta is what happens there. So we have 180 minus theta. Now this will be this is what will represent your theta throughout. Whatever you have done here will be what you'll be using as your theta in these particular places where you are dealing with the rules that happens in the quadrant. So whatever theta was here is what you'll be using. So in this case now, where we are dealing with quadrant 2, 180 minus theta, so we'll be having 180 minus 52.8. If we're dealing with quadrant 3, let's imagine we had quadrant 3 being featured, then we'll be dealing with theta plus 180, that will be 52.8 plus 180. If quadrant 4 was featured, then we'll be dealing with 360 minus 52.8. So that's just the whole hang around it. So we have 180 minus 52.8, and that will obviously give you 180 minus 52.8 will give you, I believe, 127.2. That'll be 127.2. So 127.2 and 52.8 is the two answers that we would be writing as our final answer for this particular question. So the two answers for this question number A, will be our theta being 52.8 and our theta being 127.2. So these two answers is my final answer. Let's try and solve question number 2. That will give you a much more better understanding of what we're doing. All right, so look quickly on question number 2. I told you already that the very first thing you have to do, the very first thing, is to interpret this is a word problem. So interpret the word problem very quickly. You are asked to determine all the angles between 0 and 360 degrees, whose sine is 0.7962 and then minus 0.2594. That means what angle, the sine of an angle was this. That's the interpretation of the question when we have the sine, whose sine is this. So the sine of an angle is actually this. So looking at this, you can see we have a negative sign here. But I told you the very first step you have to do is to just go on and ignore this sign, either it's positive or negative, and go on to do theta equals to arc sine. In this case now I'm ignoring if it's minus, I'll just put in 0.2594. So here I'll get my answer to be 0.2594. The arc sine of that will give me 15.03. So 15.03 degree was the theta I've been able to arrive at here. Now, mind you, I always told you, this doesn't necessarily have to be part of your answer. What will actually determine if what your answers will be your quadrant. Your quadrant is the major determinant of the final answers of questions like this. So you will have to go on to check your quadrant and examine what quadrant you'll be dealing with in this particular case. So you have the sine of an angle being negative. So the question you ask yourself is, on what quadrant do you have the sine of an angle being negative? On what quadrant do you have sine being negative? Well, don't forget that in quadrant 1 and quadrant 2, we have sine being positive. So obviously we know that our negative will be both quadrant 3 and quadrant 4. Meaning that for this particular question, question number B, we're dealing with quadrant 3 and quadrant 4 here. That's our quadrant of interest. So we have quadrant 3 and quadrant 4 as our quadrant of interest. So what do we do next? Don't forget I told you that the rule that operates in each of all these quadrants, we have 180 minus theta. We have theta plus 180 for quadrant 3, and we have 360 minus theta for quadrant 4. So now we're dealing with quadrant 3 and quadrant 4. So we'll be using theta plus 180, and we'll be using 360 minus theta. Using 360 minus theta for quadrant 4. So those are the quadrants of interest. Now, as I told you already, what this particular value you got here is what you'll be using as your theta in these cases. So theta here is 15.03. So you go on to fixing 15.03 here. That will be 15.03 plus 180. If you do 15.03 plus 180, you'll be getting a value of 195.03. 195.03. Now going on to do for quadrant 4, we have 360 minus, that will be 360 minus 15.03. And that will give me a value of, you'll be getting 344.97. 344.97. So looking at this now, these two values, that means the angles between 0 and 360 whose sine is minus 0.2594 will be 195.03 and 344.97. Those are your two answers. Don't forget, I told you already, in this case now, this particular theta you first got is not part of the answers, because I told you the quadrant is what determines what your final answer will be. So don't go on to include 15.03 as part of your answer. The two values between 0 degree and 360 degree, whose sine is this, minus 0.2594, is 195.03 and 344.97. So if you have an exam, that's what will be expected that you'll fix in as your final result. Make sure you do not include, in this particular case now, theta being 15.03. That will be wrong. The only time you include this value is if you were dealing with quadrant 1, but in this case, we're not dealing with quadrant 1. So let's try and solve probably one other question so that we can get more familiar with this topic. All right, very quickly, what I try to do here is we are solving the same question, but we're just going to be finding the cosine in this particular question. So we're going to find the angle between 0 and 360, whose cosine now is 0.7962. Again, the very first step I told you to always do, the very first step is to go on and just interpret this question. When you say whose cosine, that means you are saying the cos of an angle was equals to 0.7962. And I said the very first step you do before doing any other thing is just go on to find this arc cos of 0.7962. I told you in this stage, whatever sign was here, either positive or negative, just ignore it and just use it straight. Don't fix in minus sign here. Just use it straight up like that. So we go on to find the arc cos of this. So the arc cos of this will be 37.23. You can pause the video and try to solve this question yourself, and then move on with us in the final answer. So now we have gotten the very first theta value, but I told you already this doesn't necessarily have to be part of our answer. For us to know what our answers will be, we have to go on and investigate our quadrant. So let's try and investigate the quadrant here. We have our quadrant, add sugar to coffee, and for where we have, of course, in this case now, we are dealing with the cos of an angle being positive. You see, this is positive 0.7962. So we are looking for what quadrant do we have cos being positive. So we have cos being positive in the first quadrant and in the fourth quadrant. So first and fourth quadrant are the quadrants we're dealing with here. So we're dealing with quadrant 1 and quadrant 4. Those are the two quadrants we're dealing with. So quadrant 1 and quadrant 4 is our quadrant of interest right here. And I told you already, when you have quadrant 1 being featured, what you have to do is to just replace whatever you have gotten as theta here in that place. That's the only quadrant where you have to do that. So we have our theta here being 37.23. So this is part of our value now, degree. Now for our fourth quadrant, what we have happening in the fourth quadrant, as I told you, the rule happening there is 360 minus theta. Don't forget, this is the theta value we'll be using. So we'll be having 360 minus 37.23. You go on to do 360 minus that value, you'll be getting 322.77. So right now we have been able to arrive at our final answer. So we have 37.23. Don't forget, I told you the quadrant is what determines the final answer, not this first one. So since we have quadrant 1 featured, we're able to replicate this here. So 37.23 is one of our answer, and 322.77 is the second answer. So these are our two values whose cosine is this. So that's how you solve this. Let's solve the second question quickly. So for the second question, you can see in this case, number one step to take is to interpret the question. Of course, you are told that the cos of an angle was minus 0.2594. I told you the first step to go on with is to go on to find the arc cos, ignoring whatever sign was there. So here I'm just going to write 2594, ignoring the sign. That's just the step. And going on to find the arc cos of 0.2594, we're going to be having 74.97. So we don't necessarily have to have this as our answer. The determinant of our final answers, as I said before, is our quadrant. So we need to go on to check our quadrant to know where our values will be falling in. Add sugar to coffee. Okay, now we have a negative sign here. That means the cos of this angle was negative. So the question we'll be asking ourselves is, what quadrant do we have cos being negative? We have cos being positive in first and second. We have it being negative, obviously, in second and third. So we are dealing with quadrant 2 and quadrant 3 in this particular question. So we need to go on to find our final answer from this quadrant. So what do we have to do next? The rule that follows quadrant 2 is actually 180 minus theta. This is our theta right here. So we're having 180 minus 74.97. And if you press this on your calculator, you will be having 0.03 degree. Now, that's for quadrant 2. For quadrant 3, we have theta plus 180 as the row that happens in quadrant 3. Theta plus 180. And then we have, don't forget, 180 minus theta happens there. Theta plus 180. And the last one is 360 minus theta. So right here we have 74.97 plus 180. If you do 74.97 plus 180, that will obviously give you 254, 254.97. 254.97. So we can conclude now that the two values, the angles between 0 degree and 360, whose cosine is minus 0.2594, is 105.03 and 254.97. That gives us the final answer. All right, I would love you to attempt this question and give me your values in the comment section below. It's the same question, but in this case, the question is for you to find the angles between 0 degree and 360, whose tangent is these two particular values. I really hope you enjoyed this lecture. I hope to see you in the next video. Thank you guys. Bye-bye.